morning's webinar. We're going to get started in just one moment. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the second in our TTAC webinar series, An Introduction to Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health Concepts and Practice. My name is Meg Beyer. I am the Assistant Director of Strategic Operations at the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research, and I'm one of the partners for the TTAC project, and I'm thrilled to be with you all today. Just a few logistics about today's webinar before our wonderful presenters begin. As we've done in the past, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with the slides to the TTAC website. We will be taking questions throughout the webinar today, and we do ask that you chat in your questions using the chat box functionality, selecting the All Panelists on the dropdown so that we can collect all of your questions in one place. We are trying to set aside time at the end of today's webinar to address these questions, so please do chat them in. However, there's a lot of really important content to get to today. And if we don't get to your questions today, please know that we're collecting them all, and we do expect to have a bit more time to address questions on tomorrow's webinar. A little update about those who are interested in obtaining CEUs. For those licensed master social workers and LMHCs interested in obtaining CEUs, you must attend all 3 webinars in this series in order to obtain the CEUs. Further information will be distributed via email following the webinar series completion on how to obtain those CEUs. And finally, towards the end of the webinar, we will be sending out the feedback survey using the chat box functionality. We do ask that you click the link that is shared in the chat box. You'll see it pop up. My colleague Kevin, who is wonderful and working the back end of the webinar today, will send it out to everyone. And we simply ask that you click the link and complete the feedback survey. We appreciate you filling this out as it really allows us to understand your experience and how to enhance our future TTAC offerings. So with that, I want to thank you again for all joining us this morning, and we'll hand it over to Evelyn Blank, Associate Executive Director at the New York Center for Child Development, to get us started. Evelyn?
Thank you so much, Meg. My name is Evelyn Blank, and I'm the director of the New York City Training and Technical Assistance Center, otherwise known as TTAC. And this is funded through Thrive New York City in partnership with the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And we are very pleased to be sponsoring this 3-module series. Welcome back to those of you who joined us for Module 1. Just a brief background about who we are. And TTAC is a partnership between the New York Center for Child Development and the McSilver Institute on Poverty Policy and Research. New York Center has been a major provider of early childhood mental health services in New York, and we have expertise in informing policy and supporting the field of early childhood mental health through both training and direct practice. Our subcontractor and partner in this grant is the NYU McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research, and they house the Community and the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center, otherwise known as CTAC and MTAC. They provide ongoing technical assistance and support with a focus on business sustainability. And TTAC is tasked with building the capacity and competencies of mental health and early childhood professionals through both ongoing training and direct practice. I would encourage everybody to go to our website. This is a great resource in terms of our archived webinars, upcoming training events, as well as other resources. So it is now my privilege to introduce our esteemed presenters. Dr. Foley is a long-standing colleague and mentor. He is the clinical co-director along with Dr. Chinitz for the Training and Technical Assistance Center, TTAC. He is also the consulting clinical psychologist at New York Center for Child Development, where he served for over 20 years and also serves on our professional advisory board. And he is also Professor Emeritus at Graduate Program in Infant Mental Health and Developmental Practice at Adelphi University. Dr. Foley is a retired tenured faculty member of Furkhoff Graduate School of Psychology, where he taught for 20 years in the Department of School Clinical Child Psychology and coordinated the Infancy Early Childhood track. He was director of a federally funded training and technical assistance project that prepared infant and early childhood professionals across the nation. Dr. Foley's clinical and teaching career has been devoted in large part to working with infants and young children with special needs and their families. He is the author of several books and numerous articles. His most current book with Dr. Jane Hockman, Mental Health and Early Intervention, is published by Brooks, and he's currently co-authoring an additional book, Sensory Integration and Self-Regulation in Young Children, which will be published shortly by National 0 to 3. He lectures and consults widely. Dr. Chinitz is the other clinical co-director of the Training and Technical Assistance Center and also serves on New York Center for Child Development's Advisory Board. She is a psychologist with specialties in the areas of infant mental health and developmental disabilities in infancy and early childhood. She is the former director of the Early Childhood Center, the Center for Babies, Toddlers, and Families, and the Parent-Infant Family Court Project, which are all therapeutic programs for children birth to 5 years of age at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, where she served as a professor of clinical pediatrics and the Patricia T. and Charles S. Raisin Distinguished Scholar in Pediatrics. Dr. Chinitz is currently affiliated with the Center for Court Innovation, where she's spearheading the Strong Starts Court Initiative, which is an effort to integrate developmental science into family court practice for infants and toddlers. Dr. Chinitz is on the board of the New York 0 to 3 Network, the Community Advisory Board of the New York City Nurse-Family Partnership, the faculty of the Parent-Infant Psychotherapy Program at the Columbia University Center for Psychoanalytic Training and Research, and was previously on the local coordinating council for the New York City Early Intervention Program. And she's also been a member of the Frontiers of Innovation Initiative at the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. She has received numerous awards in recognition of her many achievements and outstanding work. So it is now my pleasure to turn this over to Dr. Foley and Dr. Chinitz.
And welcome back. I hope you're well. This morning, we're going to climb the social-emotional developmental ladder. The model in which I'm using are the functional emotional developmental levels, which were developed by the late Dr. Stanley Greenspan and Serena Wieder, Dr. Wieder. And really, these are the D of the DIR model, developmental individual difference relationship-based. Further, we will have some illustrative clips moderated by Rita Moreno that I think give us a lot in a little. And those clips were generously lent by Dr. Serena Wieder, who is the director of the Perfectum DIR Training Academy. Next. So before we actually start climbing the developmental ladder, I just put 2 slides back to back, the principles of development and the principles of infant and early childhood mental health. I'm not going to review those because you have them right here. But the point is that you're going to see as we climb the ladder and look at the clips, I think you're going to see many of these principles illustrated. I won't necessarily point them out, but I think some of them are certainly self-evident as we, again, move up the ladder. I also want to say, in terms of moving up the ladder, each of these levels, of course, is a hierarchy, but each of these levels also has its own trajectory over time. So, and it has a quality. So we can think of the ladder really as being 3-dimensional. It is hierarchical, and that, of course, is the developmental progression. Each of the levels over time, and it's within its own development. And then the 3rd dimension is the qualitative factor. I just want to point out that we already have 2 excellent webinars on the TTAC website by Dr. Romina Barros, and in these she reviewed in great detail the milestones across developmental domains. And we can think of the milestones as the trees, And since we have that beautifully presented, I felt there was no need to reinvent the wheel. I moved to talking about the levels, or what we can think of as developmental slices of life. And these are more broad-brushed and thematic. And so we can think of the milestones as the trees, and we can think of the levels as the forest. Next. So again, here are the principles of early childhood mental health. And we know that at the core of early childhood mental health really is the social emotional development. And that is why I particularly wanted to underline that. And if we can quickly go back to my stories, I'm going to briefly tell you the story of Butch. I met Butch when he was about 40 years old. Butch had spent his whole life in an institution. He was admitted when he was an infant because, given the instrumentation of the day, he scored intellectually within the disabled range. And once he was placed in the institution, he spent his whole life there. What's interesting about Butch is the likelihood is that he really was not intellectually disabled. Probably, if we looked at it in terms of today's lens, he would have had a severe learning disability and possibly some definitely emotional overlays. But he was quite verbal. He was an excellent problem solver. And in terms of his adaptation in the world, at least in the institutional world, we might say he was a bit street savvy. Butch was a leader on his unit. The superintendent of the institution would often confer with him when he wanted to get a feel for what was actually going on in the daily lives of the residents, where there were challenges and what was working. And further, Butch ran a very successful concession stand that served several units where he sold candy, snacks, and beverages, etc. Well, when the horrors of institutional life began to be known, and I might refer you to a very disquieting book by Sidney Black called Christmas in Purgatory, which really was a big stimulus for looking at the draconian dimensions of institutional life. So as this was coming to a head and we were moving toward deinstitutionalization, and we were moving to legislation that eventually led us to the consent agreement, or the act that made a free and appropriate education available to all individuals. That, of course, was 94-142, legislation 94-142. But deinstitutionalization really was kind of a trigger. And what's interesting about Butch is that he was really an identified resident to really be a test case for institutionalization, because the argument was made he was an individual who actually was functioning quite well, had many adaptive skills, and had he not been institutionalized, someone who had a great deal more potential. So as a result of the institutionalization, Butch was actually moved into community living arrangements. But Butch didn't do so well, in spite of every indication that he was going to be a model of, quote, normalization, which was the term we used in those days, that he would be normalized by living among more typical individuals and in the community. But that was not the case. Butch had more social emotional challenges than he did intellectual and problem solving and verbal ones. He got himself in trouble with the law on several occasions. He had problems with dysregulated anger and aggression. He damaged a car at one point, at another. Then, of course, when he had one of these breaks in control, the state then would move him to another community and another living arrangements in the hope that he would make a good adjustment. Yet in another one, he broke his plate glass window of a store. Butch came to me after that incident for psychotherapy when I was directing a psychological services center in a college. I found Butch to be an amazing man. He was quite articulate. He had some capacity for insight. And two key factors that really struck me was that Butch really felt that now that he was in the community, he was a nobody. But when he was in the institution, he had a place, he had a sphere of influence, and he was a person of consequence. So here again, we see how social emotional factors, self-esteem, enter into the picture. And unlike Louise and Donna, who were the Siamese twins I talked about earlier, who made a good adjustment in the community, Butch did not. And I believed, although not said directly, reading between the lines, that Butch really was mourning and grieving the institution, ironically. And at some level, if not consciously, some of these behaviors, I think, were some effort to fail in the community so that he could return home. Of course, that was not possible. So again, how social emotional factors really can be key in adjustment, and how learning and social emotional factors go together, because we know all learning is duly coded. So now I'm going to begin by walking us up the developmental ladder next. Next is level 1, shared attention and regulation. This is really in the newborn period, birth to 3. And what we really see is the child is there, the neonate is very interested in the world, oriented to the world, into the world, well prepared to integrate, listening, looking, touching, and moving, and being interested in those sensory realities. And although state regulation is still largely reflex-mediated, the child can stay in an alert enough state to interact particularly with caregivers. So sometimes think of these, what's happening in the other domains, because I will always try to point out what is happening in related areas, because we talked about how development is intimately and inextricably related. So we do see still the impact of reflex action in this period, what we might think of as inborn patterns of action and reaction. The child is working on head control. There's a little bit of really shared attention and some vocalization of pleasure and displeasure. And early play starts really with the discovery of the body, of the self, and the others, and maybe at the end of the period, object discovery. Regulation is largely external, mediated by the parent. In this slide, you're going to see this mother really holding and stabilizing the baby, and at one point doing a little rocking side to side to activate the alert state. So let's look at the illustration of level 1, interest in the world and regulation.
Babies learn to respond to the world in an organized way. Notice how easily James wakens. He will develop smooth cycles of eating and sleeping.
Hi there, wake up.
See how he uses his eyes to take in the world. Even at 8 days, he can copy his mother sticking out her tongue.
Next slide. So in the period from 3 to 6 months, the focus really now is on the attachment. It's forming relationships. And of course, the child looks to the caregiver for safety, soothing, and security. We see face gazing. We see the preferential smile, where the child really tells us that it recognizes the primary caregiver from all other people. And there is a warm exchange between the caregiver, and the infant starts now to begin to develop a wider range of affect. So the child at this stage is exhibiting a lot of positive affect. Remember, face gazing is considered the first true social response. What's happening in the next stages, or in the related areas, and maybe you could start slide and I'll talk till it comes up. In the related areas, the next slide, please. In the related areas, we're seeing now, remember, all development goes from head to foot, and we're beginning to see now more practicing of control of the center of the body. Now we begin to see some real vocal synchrony, sort of in tune with each other. There's now variance of pitch and volume, and the child can begin comforted by the mother's voice and begins babbling. The child has now discovered the external world, and we start to see object exploration. And we begin to see where the relationship is connected and then disconnected. And we know babies are in synchrony just about 40% of the time, but actually out of synchrony about 60%, and they're working on this kind of getting connected, going apart, and getting connected, which is an important part of the dance, if you will, of this stage. So if we could have the video.
When a baby learns to calm down and to use this time to reach out for human contact, she is ready for the second milestone, the ability to fall in love, to form an attachment.
Hi, Katie. Hi, Katie.
Katie is being wooed by her mother and responds to her in turn.
What are you telling me?
In this love affair, baby and mother relate to each other in many ways. They look, they touch, they move, they talk. The attachment organizes the interaction through all their senses. A secure attachment allows Joan to reach out to other things with confidence and pleasure. Mom's admiration motivates Danny to stand up and to make him feel proud.
And we saw how the attachment organizes development and motivates development. And we saw from that anchor, the baby could begin to now reach out into the larger but proximal environment. Next slide, please. Level 3, intentional two-way communication, which is in the broadly period from 4 to 10 months, is really now where we get intentional back and forth. Of course, we saw that right in slide 1. The child had serve and return. But here it's at a much higher level, more complex, and again, it is very intentional. The child now begins to have simple gestures that have shared meaning and intentionality, such as the pick-me-up gesture and point. Begin to see increasing length of gestural strings and sequences of interaction, and we call this the opening and closing of communication. And this eventually will evolve into actual continuous flow and really be a prototype for what will become conversational when the child is sufficiently, has sufficient language. Next slide, please. In the related domains, we're seeing a lot more control at the body, a lot more stability, which allows the child then to move one part with the other, as you see in pointing, for example, where he can move one finger and keep the others in a more flexed position. An important milestone at this period is being able to sit and free the hand. So the child now has enough balance and enough stability at the trunk that he no longer needs to prop. And the freeing of the hands is really catalytic because it means the child can bring the world to him or herself. We see a lot more back and forth interactions and shared intentions and shared meanings, which you're going to see in the clip. And the child now begins to have organized ways of exploring the physical world by shaking, banging, and mouthing objects. We see the child starting to combine objects in functional play. Regulation now starts to move from primarily externally oriented to mutual regulation, where the parent gives more opportunity for the child to assume their own regulatory practice and gain regulatory practice. The video clip, please.
In the third stage, babies continue to build on that special attachment and learn to play purposefully.
Oh, your mouth. Like my mouth? Yeah.
Even though Curtis doesn't yet talk, he and his mom can read each other's signals. They each know what the other wants to do next in this give and take game.
Next slide, please. Okay. In level 4, between 10 and 18 months, we see a lot of increasing motor skills. The child now can use language or gestures to get what they want. And we begin to see gestures and words being used together. There's a lot of increasing exploratory behavior, and the child becomes so much more motorically available and has much more capacity to be in the world actively. Could we see the next slide, please? I think what we see here that's so important, we see the integration of a lot of the basic components of movement, and eventually in this period, the child gets upright. So upright locomotion is, of course, absolutely essential to the process of separation and individuation. And in this period, we see the child often moving away and coming back to the parent to be refueled. We see many more shared meanings, opening and closing of multiple circles of communication. First, words emerge. Functional play now is more clearly established, and we begin to see constructive play. And we also see greater co-regulation and a increasing capacity on the part of the child to soothe themselves, which is very important. Next slide. I think we're ready for the video. In this video, you're going to see the child pointing, getting what they need. We're going to see the beginning of discovery of another child and the beginning of differentiation between self and other. And we're going to see examples of emotional refueling, and then of the child in action, running and playing in the playground. And you'll see how all of them move together to help the child now engage in novel, complex motor planning. Clips, please.
And these are when things aren't so much fun. They know how to ask for and get the help they need. It is also at this stage that babies begin to move away from their mothers to explore on their own. Purposeful action can take babies in many directions. They discover other babies. Sometimes their exploration can lead to decisive action. Deborah observes the surprising result. When first upset, Lavinia has the ability to calm down on her own. There's comfort. Al's concentration and coordination and fine motor task. Look at David's ability to run, chase, roll. Kick and
even to have knocks and falls, which is a big part of that period as well. Next slide, please. So the fifth stage, fifth level, are beginning of using symbols to express thoughts and feelings. Now, this is a very long block of time, and it really could be divided into two shorter periods, probably about 18 to 24 months, and then 24 to 30. In the first part of level 5, we really begin to see early play emerge, early symbolic use. We might really call it representational play and not yet fully symbolic play. And this is where the child, one, begins to have an increasing array of ideas, and the child starts to begin this representational period by enacting real life experiences in play with miniature objects. So feeding the baby, putting the baby to bed, giving the baby a bath. The child really reenacts in play, early play, what has been done to them. Next slide, please. So in this early period, we're now talking about 18 to 24 months, we really begin to see the motor skills continue to become more refined. Children are increasing the separation process, and we see a lot of active exploration, and they tend to like running and chasing and catching. At about 18 to 20 months, 24 months, we see a big spurt in one-word vocabulary, sometimes called the lexical spurt, and children start to make simple combinations. And again, the play is really representational, not fully symbolic, but on the cusp of becoming fully symbolic. And by about 18 months, a very important milestone, the junior toddler is able to become self-observing, which is, of course, the beginning of self-monitoring. So if we could see the first clip.
Her mommy, as she has been fed, and accepts pretend food in return. Before long, toddlers can plan to feed their own babies. Eva is now a mommy who knows what her baby needs and how to provide it. It is through such pretend play that children use their emotional experiences to organize their thoughts and actions. Eva is still tempted to use the bottle for herself as she tries out new roles and develops a sense of self.
Slide, please. So in the second half of this period, so we're now talking about that 24 to 30 month period, we really see the child now moving into symbolic play proper. Really symbolic play proper is characterized first by pretense or imagination, an ability to combine experiences in new ways and to inject the ability to talk about or play out actions that they may not have really experienced, that may be a kind of synthesis of various experiences. The child is able to engage in object substitution, which means they no longer need a replica of the real world. They can pick up a block and make believe it's a car, pick up a banana and put it to their ear. And the play now begins to have a somewhat socio-dramatic quality. It has thematic and scene-like dimensions, and there's the beginning of roles and rules. We start to see a big spurt in language, use of connected discourse and word combinations. That's a bite, and begins to ask questions. Regulation now begins to move toward early self-regulation and the use of effortful control, where the child now is really working hard to maintain a regulated state. And some of the kinds of things we would see at this time is an ability to slow down motor activity or suppressing or initiating activity to a signal that a caregiver might give, lowering the voice, effortful attention, begin to delay or inhibit a response on request, and again, decreasing amounts of external mediation, increasing participatory regulation on the part of the child becomes the norm. And if we could have the clip.
In the fifth stage, the child combines feelings and actions through the use of his imagination to create new experiences. Bob talks to his daddy, even though he isn't present. He can then shift from one drama to another as he prepares dinner for the family. Bob is the writer, director, actor, and even the critic of his new play. He uses language to describe his actions. He invites his mother to join in. He is organized and confident. He enjoys his play.
Maybe we need to adjust this. Turn these. Make it hotter.
Bob has so many ideas and feelings he wants to express.
Okay, next slide, please. So in the sixth stage of development, between 30 and 48 months, a fairly big block of time. But what we really see in the early part of this period is a deepening and expanding of play themes. And the child now starts using language more and more to organize thought and also to mediate regulation. The key feature during this period is that now the child starts to organize his ideas and play themes into increasing logical sequences. So we're really beginning to see the development of a play and language narrative that tends to have a beginning and a middle and an end. We see the emergence of roles and rules in the play. There's clear motives and consequences, and the child now begins to understand abstract language, much less reliance on any even physical object. The child can evoke scenes and ideas purely from their mental apparatus, their imagination. And we begin to see the child now actually be engaging in emotional thinking that is beginning to see the relationship between affective states and behavior. Next slide, please. Yes. So again, we see more complex motor planning, for example, being able to use a tricycle. Language begins to increase. By 3, the child has about 1,000 words, and that continues to blossom at about 50 words each month. And play now, also in this, primarily the second part of this period, becomes a modality for reality testing. The child now begins to differentiate what is make-believe, what is fantasy, and what in fact is physical descriptive reality. And we now start to see movement to true beginning self-regulation, where the child now uses conscious top-down beginning executive function to inhibit emotional expression and level of arousal. If we see the last clip, which is a very precocious 3-year-old being able to sequence ideas, to use language abstractly, to evoke material purely from mind, and also to attribute affects to the lion, as you're going to hear, and what the lion might do to eat him, and so on and so forth. So a very precocious 3-year-old using a great deal of language in their imaginative play. Please.
The lion was scary? Yes. What was he going to do to you? He's going to cut me. He was going to cut you? Yes. And then what? And then he's angry. He was angry? Yes. Oh, no. What did you do? I play and then I be sad. And then so where'd he go? He's hiding in the flowers?
Yes.
Oh.
Friday.
Is he going to come get you now, or you're safe? You're safe? He's not going to eat you? He's sleeping. Good. You have to be quiet, okay? No, we don't want to wake up that lion, or he might come and eat you. He's coming back. He's coming back? What should we do? We have to cut him. What? We have to should we do? Should we hide? Where should we hide?
That sounds perfect. Yeah. And we will really be hungry by then because it's 3 in the
In these clips and descriptions, we've taken a gallop, if you will, through about the first 48 months, looking at the various levels of social emotional development. We know, of course, that these subsume many specific milestones, which again, you can find on the webinars by Dr. Barrios. So in a summary, let's just walk through these levels again. Level 1 in the first 3 months of life are interest in the world, shared attention, and the beginning of really reflex-mediated or state regulation. Level 2 in the 3 to 6 month period, we really see the child beginning to form attachments, beginning to make relationships, and this is a period in which we see face gazing, preferential smiling, and a clear indication of the child recognizing a particular caregiver as unique among all others. Level 3, we begin to see now shared intentionality in terms of two-way communication. We've seen it right from birth, of course, where there's serve and return, but it's more inborn patterns of action and reaction at work. But here we begin to see true intentional interactions. It doesn't have to be verbal or even vocal. Of course, it can be visual, it can be gestural, but there's also an amazing beginning of reading of skills. Level 4, which is really the beginning of problem solving. We begin to see the child now being able to and exhibit a wide range of ideas and to act on ideas through gesture and begin to get what they need. We see an increase in motor skills and integration of the components of movement. Children can, for example, start to creep away from the parent at this stage. They're going into the world. They can sit free hands, bring the world to themselves. They get upright during this period, of course, which is kind of miraculous perceptual revolution. And they become, in fact, problem solvers. At level 5, which we could divide into basically 2 periods, from about 18 months to 24 and 24 to 30 to 36. In the 18 to 24 month, we really see now the threshold of what will become fully symbolic play. It starts out at this period as representational play, where the child reenacts pretty much the activities of daily living. And by about in the 24 to 36 month period, we really now see this play moving from representational play to full-blown symbolic play. Remember, symbolic play is characterized by imagination or pretense. The child can go beyond the experienced activities of daily living, for example, as a basis for play content. The play can involve object substitution, so the child no longer needs physical replicas. They can imagine a block as a car, for example. It begins to have thematic or scene qualities, and if there are other children, a real true social dramatic dimension. And finally, true by play has roles and rules. And then level 6, which is from 30 to about 48 months, we now really see the full-blown play period, if you will, where children now can express content fully from their imagination. They need no concrete reference. They can sequence their ideas in a simple way to make a a prototypic kind of narrative, often with a beginning, a middle, and an end. They start to have emotional ideas, and they can recognize emotions and see the relationship between emotions and behavior. And we see a great differentiation of the affective array and see how affect organizes experience and development. So that is our portrait of social, emotional, functional development in the first 48 months of life. And with that foundation and that model, we're now going to move on with Dr. Susan Chinitz, my esteemed colleague, who is now going to talk about when development strays from the scope of typical or the scope of mental health.
Okay, there we go. Anyway, I was thanking Gil for his presentation and wanted to say that it's always fascinating for me and inspirational to listen to you speak about development from so many different perspectives, and always an honor to work with you on this project. For the remainder of this webinar and throughout the webinar tomorrow, we'll be talking about risks to social emotional development and to infant mental health. So between 9 and 14% of children birth to 5 years of age experience social emotional problems that negatively impact their functioning, development, and school readiness. These are the children who come to your clinical attention. The peak prevalence of recognized disorders within this age group is at 4 years of age, but the origins of these can be and often are much earlier. In all cases, the earlier the intervention, the better. The purpose of this part of the webinar is to clarify the pathways to disorders in the social emotional domain and to consider approaches to intervention. There we go. Okay. Foley, who's the founder of attachment theory, said that essential for mental health is that an infant and young child experience a warm, intimate, and continuous relationship with his mother or mother substitute in which both find satisfaction and enjoyment. And as Gil shared on Monday, Winnicott said there is no such thing as an infant, meaning that whenever one finds an infant, one finds maternal care, and without maternal care, there would be no infant. Samiloff and Ed.D. said if the individual is not a suitable level of analysis for infant development, neither is the individual a suitable level of analysis for understanding infant behavioral disorders. Infant mental health clinicians have always advocated for understanding children's emotional functioning in the context of their primary relationship and framing interventions in a relational context. Okay, next. To briefly review the foundational concepts that Bill discussed, social emotional development is the foundation for mental health and well-being throughout the lifespan. Critical social emotional competencies develop during the first 5 years of life, and they develop in the context of children's earliest relationships and with the support of their caregivers. Social emotional development is a bidirectional process to which the infant and parent or caregiver each contribute. If that's the case for healthy social emotional development, so too it is most often the case where social emotional problems emerge. Okay. Risk factors in social emotional development may be introduced by issues that the child brings to the relationship or that the parents or caregivers bring. There can also be risks that are inherent to the interaction of these child and parent factors, including the goodness of fit between child and parent characteristics, or more accurately, in the poor fit between these, or the lack of adaptability on the part of one or both partners. Then there are family and environmental risk factors, such as exposure to violence. And finally, the problem of cumulative risk which we'll talk about in tomorrow's webinar, but is essentially when a child is exposed to multiple risk factors, which when taken together, reduce the child's capacity for resilience. Next slide. Other contextual influences on social emotional development include the overall emotional climate of the home, the child's relationship to siblings, grandparents, and other household members, family resources, and the degree of social support available to the family, community resources, and in some cases, the quality of the child care setting and the child's relationship with child care providers. Next slide, please. I'd like to take a minute to share a case I worked on that I hope will highlight some of what we'll talk about in this webinar and in the one tomorrow. Nina was a 4-year-old child whose mother brought her to clinical attention due to concerns about her behavior. In discussing these behavior problems, they seemed minor and not a concern of Nina's preschool teacher or of her father, but rather just Nina's mother. In exploring these further, the mother ultimately acknowledged with a great deal of sadness and discomfort that she didn't like this child, could not warm up to her, did not feel the same love for Nina that she felt for her 2 older sons. This was understandably very upsetting to this mother and were feelings she had had for a very long time. Yet who can you tell of such feelings? The mother was ashamed to feel this way about her daughter and was not prone to share this with anyone in her social circle of family and friends. Nina had been born with a congenital deformity of one of her eyes. She was blind in that eye but had full vision in the other eye and had few, if any, functional impairments. However, the mother, who I'll call Dr. K, she had a doctorate in languages, described a lack of bonding when she nursed Nina as an infant and was not able to maintain eye gaze with her when she nursed her on the side of the bad eye. She thought that might have been contributory, and perhaps it was to some degree. But further discussion over many subsequent sessions revealed that Dr. K, who grew up in a different country, had a younger brother born with multiple congenital anomalies. He died when he was 4. Dr. K recalled the grief and bereavement her parents experienced as a result of this loss, grief that lasted for many years and was quite disturbing to Dr. K as a child. Nina's eye deformity triggered memories of that traumatic experience, and Dr. K ultimately understood throughout therapeutic work that there was a ghost in her nursery that was impacting her feelings about her own child. In essence, she felt afraid that she might incur a similar terrible loss and was protecting herself from this by not allowing herself to get close to Nina. We will talk about ghosts in the nursery in the webinar tomorrow, but this case came to mind in thinking about the contributions of both members of the dyad to relational risk. Next slide, please. For the rest of this webinar, we will focus on the child factors that contribute to relational or social emotional problems. We will talk specifically about disability, prematurity, and regulatory problems, including fussy baby syndrome, sensory processing disorders, and overactivity disorders. Next slide, please. As Gil has so eloquently described for us, all of the developmental domains are inextricably linked. Advances and competencies in one domain catalyze progress in the other domains, and conversely, disability or disorder in any domain contributes to difficulties in other domains. Children with sensory, motor, or language delays and disabilities are at risk for problems in social-emotional development. Next slide. While most of you will not work with children who are blind, as this is fortunately a rare disorder, I thought to share this work with you, as it both touches on some of the issues raised in my work with Nina's mother and also on the interdependence of the different domains of development. Selma Freiberg, a pioneer in the field of infant mental health and the clinician who introduced the idea of births in the nursery, conducted a study of congenitally blind infants and toddlers and published her findings in a book called Insights from the Blind. The study population consisted of 10 infants, blind from birth but otherwise neurologically intact, whose development was facilitated by a home-based education and guidance program. Next, please. In describing the impact of blindness on human attachment, Freiberg noted the extraordinary problems for the blind baby and his parents in making the vital human connections. For the parents, the inability of the infant to gaze at them, follow and track their movements, and smile at them in the earliest weeks of life adversely affected parents' sense that the baby recognized them, knew them, and showed preference for them. There were delays in the appearance of the social smile and an absence of differentiated facial expressions that are usually elicited when babies look at their parents. Clinicians had to help parents understand the baby's signs of preference and valuation, often read through their motor actions and vocalizations, and thus to find reward in their babies. They had to help the babies also achieve focused human partnership. Next. Lack of sight made it difficult for babies to learn about the physical presence and permanence of people and objects, and to learn about the contours and boundaries of things as separate from themselves. A fundamental finding of Freiberg's was that sound alone did not do this. Sound did not confer objectivity to blind babies. This had to be taught. When it came to babies' relationships, blindness resulted in delays in separation anxiety, as the infant did not appreciate that the mother was an object external to himself. And later, it made it difficult for the baby to rely on a mental representation of the mother that could sustain him in her absence. When I think about blind babies in the context of what Freiberg taught us, I also think about babies' use of social referencing, their reliance on their parents' facial expressions and reactions to discern whether or not a situation is safe. So much information lost from this modality. Next slide, please. And though the impact of blindness on motor development is a little less germane to our discussion today, I have always found these findings to be interesting, so I'm sharing. The fact that sounds did not connote substantiality or objectivity to these babies affected their fine and gross motor development. Freiberg said that during the period of development when the sighted child is achieving proficiency in the coordination of reaching for and attaining an object, blind babies did not reach for people or things, even when a voice or sound provided cues. And where vision would have brought the hands together at midline for fingering, transferring, and coordinate use, intervention needed to provide the tactile auditory lures to stimulate object exploration. And in the gross motor domain, there was a similar finding. Blind babies got into the posture for crawling at the same age as sighted babies, but they didn't move forward, they didn't progress. And Freiberg talked about how they had to, again, connect sound to something to crawl to, and that once they did establish that connection, they did crawl, so that sound could now substitute for sight in providing a lure for the initiation of mobility. Next slide, please. Okay, so in contrast to blindness, language delays and impairments are the most common developmental problems that young children present. Language problems can be primarily receptive, primarily expressive, or a combination of both. Sometimes language delays are also associated with articulation impairment. There's a very high concordance between language delays and disabilities and behavior problems. When we think of it, the primary function of communication is impacted. The child cannot make his needs known and sometimes resorts to physical action, including aggressive behavior, to solve problems or to express negative emotions. The focus on language production sometimes obscures the importance of recognizing children's receptive language problems. But receptive problems make it difficult for the child to orient to what's happening around him, to engage in meaningful communicative exchanges, or to follow directions. Social interactions and play with peers can be difficult if the child cannot keep up with the play narrative or otherwise communicate as the other children expect. I've always found that parents can often describe children's language delays quite accurately, but do not always connect this to the child's behavior. Psychoeducation is something we can offer to parents of children with language delays to help them think through the connections and implications of the language problem to other aspects of the child's functioning. We can also help them with strategies for supporting children's understanding and orientation by simplifying the language that's used and the directions that are provided to the child, by establishing eye contact during communication to focus the child's attention and capacity to benefit from cues, and by using picture schedules and other pictorial supports in general as examples. Next slide. Language is also a means by which we regulate our behavior. The process begins with dyadic regulation, with the parents supply much of the regulatory guidance, such as don't touch that pot. Then the child adopts the regulatory language of the parent in their own self-directed but still external or audible speech. And finally, this guiding language becomes internalized or inner speech experienced as thought. Psy.D was a Russian psychologist who wrote a lot about the regulatory function of language. Children with language delays or impairments do not have this capacity to the extent that their same-age peers do, resulting sometimes in less regulated behavior and fewer internal models for problem solving. Next slide, please. Yeah, that one, good. And finally, language serves as a distal means of maintaining attachment and goal-directed partnerships. As toddlers are able to create more physical distance between themselves and their caregivers, taking pleasure in their explorations and increased autonomy, language becomes an important means of sustained contact with attachment figures. Difficulty relying on this type of contact over distance may shift the child's balance between attachment and exploration. And it also impacts on the dyad's capacity to engage in goal-corrected partnerships, which are the negotiations about limits and allowances that are typical and important in the toddler years. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to talk about children who have physical and motor disabilities. Physical and motoric disabilities may impede the way children learn about their world starting in infancy with how they are or aren't able to manipulate objects. And as Gil talked about on Monday, how the whole child's perceptual perspective shifts as they move from a sitting child to a crawling and to a walking child. These are all stages in learning about the world that are harder for kids with motor and physical disabilities. And from a social emotional perspective, physical and motor disabilities impede the process of separation individuation, as children cannot as readily establish body boundaries, separate themselves from their caregivers, and don't always experience the love affair with the world or the practicing that locomotor skills catalyze. The child's sense of autonomy and mastery may be affected, and they may be more restricted in participation in activities that other children enjoy. So we're going to shift to the relational impact of disability. The birth of a child with a disability, or the discovery of a disability in a child later on, usually constitutes a crisis in a family. Most often totally unexpected, this event triggers an array of psychological and emotional responses in a parent that can tax their capacity to cope. And while every parent responds differently and has different strengths and vulnerabilities that support or complicate their adjustment, there are some predictable responses that may have impact on the child's social emotional development. Next slide, please. Gill actually made an important contribution to the field's understanding of the loss-grief cycle. The discovery of disability in a child brings the loss for a parent of the hoped-for and idealized child who forms in the parent's imagination and fantasy during pregnancy. This loss triggers a sense of grief, not unlike the process of grief set into place by a death. In many ways, this is a death of the child the parent expected to have. Parents describe feelings of disorientation, with responses ranging from disbelief to shock and panic. Once recovered from the shock, some parents begin a stage of searching for the hoped-for child in the form of denial or searching for a different opinion or prognosis. When this fails, the parent may face the reality of the situation, but may then experience other difficult emotions, including anger, depression, guilt, helplessness, or isolation. Recovery is usually attained over time. Most often, parents' attachments to their children prevail and elicit the protective and proactive behaviors usually inherent to parenting. However, parents are vulnerable to recurrence of the loss and grief as the child's development increasingly deviates from typical, and often at times of transitions in systems and services which are both ongoing reminders of the chronicity of the child's disabilities. Next slide, please. All of this occurs during a critical stage for the formation of the child's secure attachment. While the baby needs the attention, responsiveness, and nurturing care of the parent's attention may be diverted or diminished by the multiple emotional strains we've discussed and by practical problems such as securing services for their child. And while all parents grapple with ambivalence in the adjustment to a new baby and the multiple demands and adjustments this brings, their ambivalence may be heightened by the parent's disappointment or despair about the disability. At the very least, it's a stage of vulnerability in the developing relationship. Okay, thank you. Next slide, we're going to talk about prematurity. While the premature birth of a baby does not always result in disability for a child, it still thrusts the family into a set of experiences that create enormous stress and for an indefinite course, which in some cases can be a very long time. Depending on the degree of prematurity, and especially if there is extreme prematurity, the precariousness of the child's prognosis for survival is traumatic for the parent and engenders extreme anxiety. Conditions for the baby, including high levels of physical stimulation in the NICU, painful medical procedures, and a lack of holding is also highly adverse for the baby. A time usually characterized by intense parental care becomes instead a time when the baby's care is turned over to medical professionals. Parents are usually unable to do the typical things that promote attachment, including holding, cuddling, and feeding the baby. While advances in developmentally and relationship-focused care have led to some improvements, most notably the advent of kangaroo care as an example, in which parents are encouraged to hold their babies on their bare skin, often parents feel apprehensive and anxious about handling a child whose physical state is so fragile. Sometimes the precariousness of the child's medical problems and chances for survival are another impediment to the parent's attachment to the child, as some parents try to protect themselves from the possible loss of a baby with such severe medical problems. And upon discharge from the hospital, premature babies may continue to be difficult to care for. They can struggle with state regulation and may be more drowsy than other newborns. They may provide more diffuse cues, respond less consistently, or may have more limited repertoires of responsiveness than full-term babies. Their medical problems tend to persist and require ongoing medical appointments and follow-up. The birth of a premature child may also impact on other children in the family and often requires adjustment in parents' work and social activities. Next slide, please. Thank you. Some babies have a cluster of behaviors that earn them the designation of a fussy or high-need baby. These behaviors are characterized by excessive crying, inconsolability, fussiness, high sensitivity to their environment, intense responses, difficulties with feeding, and unpredictable sleep patterns. Sometimes the baby is considered to have colic, which is defined as 3 or more hours of crying, 3 or more days a week, for 3 weeks or more. Colic begins around 2 to 3 weeks of age, peaks at 6 weeks, and is usually gone by 4 months of age. If these behaviors persist beyond that time, the term high needs or fussy baby are sometimes used. These behaviors are considered to be part of the baby's constitution and not a result of parenting problems. Nonetheless, parents are often highly stressed and overwhelmed by the persistence of these behaviors and the daily wear and tear of taking care of a baby like this. They're often fatigued and sleep deprived. In some situations, parents wonder if the baby dislikes them or worry that they must be doing something wrong. The greatest risk seems to be when parents are highly stressed by their general circumstances, a difficult history of their own, or minimal social support. In these cases, parents may not have the wherewithal to cope with the child's constant crying, or most importantly, to regulate their own stress. Next slide, please. Sometimes young children's irritable, aggressive, avoidant, or fearful behavior may be the manifestation of a sensory processing disorder. Sensory processing disorders are abnormalities or differences in how children regulate and cope with sensory input, such as sound, touch, light, smell, or taste. Children who have sensory processing difficulties often register typical sensory inputs as overwhelming, overpowering, and noxious. The sound of a vacuum cleaner, for example, may be very disturbing to a young child with sensory processing disorders, or a train passing by, or the siren of an ambulance. It can make the child cover their ears in distress, seem fearful, or even avoid situations they associate with loud sounds. Some children are overly sensitive to touch. They don't like the feel of certain clothing on their bodies, especially if the fabric is rough or itchy, or if there are seams or tags that register for them in ways that are not even perceived by other children. They might refuse to get dressed, to wear what a parent has selected, or to insist only on particular items of clothing that have been worn and washed enough to be soft and non-intrusive on their bodies. Some parents have to take the tags out of all articles of clothing. When this is the case, children's behavior is often confusing to their parents, because the child is not able to verbalize the source of their discomfort or explain what they are responding to. Parents often struggle to understand why the child is so irritable, has difficulty adjusting to new places or activities, or even to familiar places or activities, or why the child even acts aggressively at times with no apparent provocation. I worked with a child who was referred due to persistently aggressive behavior that to his parents had no explanation. There was no aggression in his family or violence in his history. Parents were nurturing, and he was not in any situation in preschool or at home that were obviously stressful. The parents were very distressed by this aggressive behavior and extremely confused. Describing what it was like for them, the father mentioned that the child hit him in the head with a hard plastic toy he had been holding when the father did something totally benign, or so he thought, by wiping the child's mouth after he had eaten something messy. This description provided a clue. Children with tactile sensitivities or an over-responsiveness to touch often have great sensitivity around their mouths. When I followed up on this clue, it turned out that the father was able to endorse a lot of other symptoms of the child's hypersensitivity. But because this was a very young child, he was not able to indicate that this was the source of his distress and discomfort. The parents were not able to put all the pieces together, largely because this is not one of the disorders that people know a lot about. Educating this family about sensory processing disorders provided a great sense of relief. It freed them from feeling that their child did not like them, and it paved the way for them to understand how to modify the environment and the child's experiences to buffer the impact of these sensitivities. You can see how sensory processing disorders can impact children's social emotional development, as they often cause a lot of stress to their caregivers, impact the child's ability to play or socialize with other children, and have difficulty adjusting to new surroundings and situations, and thus limit the experiences that promote social emotional growth. These children may have very poor self-control, especially when overloaded or very distressed by sensation. Okay, next slide, please. Sensory processing disorders are inborn constitutional difficulties that emanate from the child's neurobiology. They also include the child's responses to lesser-known sensory systems, such as the vestibular system, or how the child responds to his body's movement in space. This may show in the child's discomfort with balance, swinging, and other anti-gravity activities, sometimes on the playground. Sensory processing disorders may be the only problem the child has, or they may co-occur with other neurodevelopmental problems. For example, sensory processing disorders are often present in children with autism spectrum disorders, although again, they can occur as separate and independent disorders. I'm going to skip the next two slides because they just provide a little bit more detail that I think is not necessary, and we're going to go to overactivity and impulsivity. Okay, thank you. Some children present with extremely high activity levels, often combined with impulsivity. The diagnosis of attention deficit disorder is generally reserved for children over 3 years of age. However, these behaviors do not first appear at 3, but rather often present much earlier. The new diagnosis in DC 0 to 5 of overactivity disorder of toddlerhood acknowledges that a cluster of overactive and impulsive behaviors are often seen in children younger than 3 years of age. Next slide, please. Children with extremely high activity levels put great stress on their parents and caregivers, primarily because they have to be supervised at all times and are prone to get into dangerous situations themselves or to impose danger on others, including younger children in the family. You don't easily obey commands or follow directions. And they can be destructive of others' belongings, even if unintentionally. This all becomes particularly concerning when parents have other stressors and fewer internal resources to cope with stress. A well-known risk factor is the combination of difficult child behavior and high degrees of parental stress. This often leads to a pattern of coercive or harsh parenting, which tends to exacerbate the child's behavior problems and increase the probability of poor child outcomes. Children with high activity levels also have difficulty playing cooperatively with other children and may be disliked or avoided by other children because of their disruptive behavior. Of great concern is that accumulated reprimands and rejections impair their self-esteem, and they often come to think of themselves as bad. They have difficulty engaging in sustained object play or imaginative play, and thus do not easily develop the skills that emerge from these types of activities. Their impulsivity precludes their ability to learn to problem solve or to negotiate with other children without a lot of help and support. Okay, next slide. So to summarize the relational contributions of disability and other child factors, the impact of disability is mediated through the parent-child relationship. The severity of disability is often in the eyes of the beholder. I've worked with parents of severely disabled children who have taken this all in their stride, and I've worked with parents of children with mild disabilities who've had very catastrophic reactions. So we have to be mindful of that interface and interaction. To varying degrees, parental reactions depend on overall mental health and their stage of adjustment in the loss grief cycle. Also depends on the level of social support that they have and the emotional climate of the child's caregiving network. Also depends on their resources for securing adequate interventions and for helping the child compensate for some of the things that we've talked about. Next slide. Next slide, thank you. And finally, implications for intervention. First, I strongly suggest that as mental health clinicians, we all collaborate with our interdisciplinary peers. Jill and I have had the very good fortune of working as members of interdisciplinary teams and of learning so much with our occupational therapy, physical therapy, and speech-language therapy colleagues and peers. Second, we can play a very important role in psychoeducation to parents about the interface between domains of development and the implications of children's disabilities for their behavior and their social emotional functioning. We can provide support for parents, including concrete information and resources, helping them obtain parent-to-parent support, and providing our ongoing emotional support. As Gil said on Monday, sometimes we don't even have to do very much more than be there for parents of children with these problems, for them to know there's somebody they can always turn to for support and positive regard. We need to monitor for the level of stress in parents taking care of children who have difficulties of one kind or another, stress in the parents and stress in the family. And we need to do everything we can do to support the relationship. We'll talk more tomorrow about treating to the relationship. Will be a very, very big focus. Again, there are references to this part of the webinar, and I thank you for your listening this morning. And it seems like we do have a little bit of time left in case anyone has questions for Gil or for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Again, what an enriching webinar to participate in, and thank you so much for walking us through all this really valuable and important information. I'm going to ask my colleague Kevin as we wait to, or we do have some time to answer some questions, but before we do that, I do want to ask Kevin to chat out in the chat box to all of our attendees the link to this feedback survey. So we're just asking that you click on the link. It'll pop up. It should pop up in a separate web browser. And if you take a minute to fill it out after we wrap up with questions, that would be wonderful and most appreciated. We review all the feedback that we receive. And so I'll thank you in advance for filling that out. But with no further ado, I'm going to ask if Evelyn would like to review some questions that have been chatted in.
Absolutely. And first of all, I want to thank Gil and Susan. This was an incredibly rich presentation, and I look forward to the third one as well. And I want to thank everybody also for chatting in your questions. And given time, we're not going to be able to get to all of them today, but we will respond to all questions either through email or on tomorrow's webinar. So please know that anything that you texted in, we will definitely get back to you with. I also want to say that there were a lot of questions chatted in around sensory processing disorders, and I would like to direct people to an archived webinar on our TTAC website by Maria Anzalone that I think is extremely informative. And we will respond to your questions, but it seems like this is an area of great interest. So one of the questions was, given the circumstances that we are living in as we quarantine, many parents are allowing more screen time for their children in order to be able to work from home or just to keep them entertained. How is this going to affect the development of children as they spend less time playing and more time using technology? And somebody else also asked, how do you think that technology impacts the ability for parents and children to connect and potentially limits a child's desire to explore their environment?
I'll start with that one, Evelyn, and thank you for that very timely and relevant question. We're all in that circumstance now with young children, children of all ages, needing to be busy and occupied all day. So although we have often held to limits on what we recommend for very young children and screen time, we all do appreciate that the stresses imposed on us may require some breakdown of those limits for everybody to maintain their own regulation. I think that a lot has to do with the quality of the things that children are allowed to use to watch as we loosen up our limits a little bit. Things that we know to be of high quality, some of the things that are on public broadcasting or otherwise backed by good child development foundations are probably okay for children to watch if they have to watch more than usual. So I think it's about the quality and certainly the extent to which an adult can oversee and monitor and participate with the child certainly helps too. The other kinds of technology that we're totally relying on now is technology that allows us to be in contact with our family. FaceTime or Skype, or children are missing their contacts with their preschool teachers, with their grandparents, and so I think that's very important to allow for children right now so that they don't think that everybody's disappeared from their world. So I think it's about quality, and I think it's about the purpose of the screen time, and I think it's about allowing ourselves to relax our standards a little bit in the context of an emergency that we hope will not last that long.
This is Gil. I just want to say, one of the few longitudinal studies that have been done on screen time, it was a large sample, but did show the relationship between screen time, excessive screen time, and failing on screening tests or having difficulties in screening tests or at risk on screening tests in a number of areas. However, I really think we're in an exceptional time right now, and it is understandable that parents need to have relief and deal with the complexity of what's going on. I think, as Susan said, it's quality. I think if children are are on screen time, what's important is to break that up, to be available periodically for interaction, for that two-way communication, for renewing that face gazing and smiling and emotional refueling. And I think if we can interject those kinds of inoculations, so to speak, I think the impact of screen time in a negative way will be neutralized, and that interaction will serve as a protective factor.
Thank you. So there was another question about, is there a normal or expected level of sensory sensitivity in toddlers? For example, is it typical for children to go through phases where they're afraid of the vacuum? Or would you suspect sensory processing issues in this case?
I'll start, Gil, you can add. Yes, there definitely is a continuum, like everything else, about things that are in the normal or typical range, where children do still show signs of some sensitivities, but it's not impairing their functioning. We talk about sensory processing difficulties when these sensitivities start to impair the child's functioning, limit the things they can participate with, or cause distress to the child or to the family. But I think we will recognize in ourselves and in everybody that's close to us who we know quite well that there is a continuum, and that many of us have certain levels of sensory sensitivity or different sensory preferences that don't constitute a disability. For example, I have a very hard time in places with very loud noises. I prefer to be in places that are not extremely loud. However, that sensitivity does not impact my functioning. I've seen it in, my children and my grandchildren. I think we can appreciate that there's, this is a human factor that has the same variability, and we just become concerned when the level or severity or the multiplicity of these sensitivities impact the child's functioning.
Yeah, I'd like to comment that, of course, when you have an immature central nervous system in younger children, and also children are, in many cases, just being exposed to certain kinds of stimuli. So it is, like everything else, there's a developmental continuum, and so you would expect younger children to have reactivity to certain types of stimuli. I think that what we would want to look at is to what degree does it interfere with function? Do you see the child habituate to stimuli? So a child might be sensitive to the vacuum cleaner. Does repeated exposure seem to reduce the level of reactivity? That is one of the, look at the research, that's one of the factors that distinguishes when a sensory problem is within normal, typical limits, or when it now starts to move out of that range. Does the individual, the child, habituate to the stimuli? And do you see the child tolerating it better over developmental time? Now, Susan's going to talk later about some screening instruments, but if we're really concerned whether a child's reactivity is within typical limits or not, there are some very simple screening tests, the sensory profile 2, for example. There's a short form, and that can give us some pretty sound, valid, and reliable data to say, is this within typical limits or is it not?
Terrific. Okay. There's a question, Gil, about the types of disabilities that were mentioned in the grief slide. If you could just expand a little bit on what kinds of disabilities may really result in a grief response.
Well, when I did the original research, we followed 24 families. These were intact families, and by today's standards, they certainly were not representative. And all of those children had very severe disabilities that were pretty much of a neurophysiological nature. Cerebral palsy and cognitive deficits, et cetera. But I think the grief reaction, certainly where you're dealing with children with that magnitude of difficulty, is, very clear that the children really differed a great deal from the child one had anticipated having. But I think, like everything else, it's very individual. And I think a key factor in the loss grief reaction is that the loss. The loss meaning the loss of the hoped for child, the fantasized child, what Ken Moses called the death of the dream. certainly in the population we found, yes, these children were very impaired. But, you know, I've seen families where they have a relative, basically a typical child, and yet they have expectations for this child's development or, you know, future that may not be met. And for some families, that is enough to trigger a loss, even though the child is functioning relatively well. So I think there certainly is a continuum. I think you have to really look at each family individually. But I think when you have a visible disability, a diagnosable disability, I think in many cases that does trigger a loss grief reaction.
So thank you so much, and we're really at the end of our time here. I want to say that there have been some really amazing questions that were texted in, and I want to let people know that we will get to them. We will review all, and hopefully we'll either answer them tomorrow or we'll actually send emails to the actual person who asked the questions. So just a reminder, if everybody could please fill out the evaluation. We very much want your feedback, and I just want to give an incredible thanks to Gil and Susan for such a comprehensive and informative presentation. We hope that you will all join us tomorrow for Module 3, and I thank you for kind of what you brought to this important and vast subject. Thank you.
Thank you.